Imagine standing on a windswept island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by nearly 1,000 massive stone faces, staring inland with hollow eyes. Some stand upright on stone platforms, weighing up to 80 tons. Others lie toppled on their sides, half buried in volcanic soil. And scattered across the landscape, hundreds more remain unfinished in their quarry, frozen mid-creation, as if the sculptors simply dropped their tools and walked away. For decades, when people looked at Easter Island, they saw a mystery. But more than that, they saw a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when a civilization destroys its own environment. Except, what if almost everything you've been told about Easter Island is wrong? What if the real story isn't about environmental suicide at all, but something far more tragic, far more complex, and far more human? The question that has haunted researchers for decades is deceptively simple. What happened to the people who built the Moai? For years, you've probably heard the story. It goes something like this. The Easter Islanders, in their obsession with building ever larger statues, cut down every tree on the island. Without wood, they couldn't build boats to fish. Without trees, the soil eroded. Food became scarce. Society collapsed into warfare and chaos. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, they found only a few thousand people living among the ruins of their own making. A perfect parable about environmental destruction, right? A warning from the past about what happens when a civilization exceeds its limits. Except, here's the thing. That story, it might be almost entirely wrong. The real story of Easter Island's transformation is far more complex, far more tragic, and in many ways, far more relevant than the simple morality tale we've been told. It's a story that involves millions of hungry rats, resilient farmers, devastating disease, and perhaps one of history's most overlooked genocides. So let's go back to an island, 2,300 miles from the coast of Chile. 1,200 miles from the nearest inhabited neighbor, back to Rapa Nui. Around the year 1200 of the Common Era, when Polynesian voyagers first landed on this tiny speck of volcanic rock in the vast Pacific, they found paradise. The island was covered in forests dominated by massive Pachylicocos palm trees, relatives of the Chilean wine palm. These giants could live for 500 years, growing up to 50 feet tall. Their canopies shading a landscape that would have seemed impossibly lush to seafarers who'd just crossed thousands of miles of open ocean. Archaeological evidence suggests that between 15 and 19 million of these palm trees once covered Easter Island. That's right, 15 to 19 million trees on an island that's only 24 miles long and 12 miles wide. It would have been a forest so dense, so verdant, that early European visitors struggled to reconcile what they saw in 1722 with what must have existed before. The Polynesians who arrived brought with them their survival package: sweet potatoes, taro, bananas, yams. They brought chickens, they brought their gods and their traditions. And unintentionally, tucked into the hulls of their double-hulled canoes, they brought something else, something small, unremarkable, and ultimately devastating: the Polynesian rat. Now, before we talk about what happened next, we need to understand something crucial about Easter Island's ecosystem. These palm trees had evolved in isolation, co-evolving with birds, not mammals. They had no natural defenses against rodent predation, no boom and bust seed production cycles that would overwhelm predators, no chemical deterrents in their nuts. To the Polynesian rat, arriving on an island with no predators and unlimited food, these palm nuts were candy, and the rats went absolutely bananas. Recent research published in 2025 has revealed just how catastrophic this invasion was. Using ecological modeling, scientists determined that a single breeding pair of rats could explode to a population of 11.2 million in just 47 years. 11 million rats. On a small island, each one feasting on palm nuts, preventing the next generation of trees from ever taking root. The rats ate an estimated 95% of all palm seeds before they could germinate. But here's where the story gets more nuanced than the simple tale we've been told. It wasn't just the rats. The humans played a role to clearing land for their sweet potato fields using slash-and-burn agriculture. The combination of human land clearing and rat predation created a perfect storm for deforestation. Between approximately 1200 and 1650 of the Common Era, those 15 to 19 million palm trees gradually disappeared. But, and this is crucial, this deforestation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden ecological catastrophe. It was gradual, uneven across the island, and most importantly, it didn't destroy the civilization. In fact, the Rapa Nui people adapted remarkably well. As the forests thinned and disappeared, they developed sophisticated agricultural techniques that might surprise you. They created rock gardens, using volcanic stones to mulch the soil, retain moisture, and protect crops from the wind. These lithic mulch gardens, as archaeologists call them, were engineering marvels. They allowed the Rapa Nui to sustainably farm sweet potatoes, their staple crop, on an island with poor volcanic soil and limited rainfall. Recent studies using advanced imaging technology have mapped these gardens across the island. The findings are striking. The rock gardens could have supported a population of around 3,000 to 4,000 people indefinitely. The island's sustainable carrying capacity was about 3,000 to 4,000 people, not 15,000, not 20,000. The population never exceeded what the island could support. There was no overshoot, no Malthusian collapse. Throughout this period, from roughly 1200 to the early 1700s, the Rapa Nui continued to build and erect moai. Construction didn't stop because of deforestation. Why? Because they had developed ingenious methods to move these massive statues. If you watched my previous video on how the moai were constructed and transported, you'll remember that they didn't need thousands of logs to move the statues. They walked them, using ropes and coordinated teams, swaying them forward in an upright position. The absence of trees didn't end moai construction. In fact, some of the most sophisticated statues were erected well into this period. The society wasn't collapsing, it was adapting, evolving. But then something changed. Not in 1600, not because of trees or soil or rats. The change came in 1722. That's when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday, giving the island its European name. He found between 2,000 and 3,000 people. He noted the treeless landscape, but also recorded that the islanders appeared healthy, well-fed, and their society seemed intact. He saw standing moai. He saw agricultural fields. Some of his men, eager to demonstrate European superiority, opened fire on the islanders during a misunderstanding. Between 10 and 12, Rapa Nui were killed in this first contact. James Cook visited in 1774, just 52 years later. He too found thousands of people, though he noticed many moai had been toppled. For years, this was seen as evidence of internal warfare, of a society tearing itself apart. But recent archaeological evidence suggests many moai fell due to earthquakes or were ritually decommissioned, not destroyed in conflict. When French explorer Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, arrived in 1786, he found about 2,000 people. His descriptions are telling. He wrote that the islanders lived well, that their sweet potato fields were productive, that 3 days' work a year would be enough to support the population. This doesn't sound like a society in collapse, does it? But then came 1862, and with it, the true catastrophe. In December of that year, 8 Peruvian slave ships arrived at Easter Island. What followed was one of the most devastating slave raids in Pacific history. The ship's crews spread trade goods on the beach, mirrors, cloth, attractive items to draw people near. When enough islanders had gathered, the slavers opened fire and rounded them up. Over the course of several raids in 1862 and 1863, approximately 1,400 to 1,500 Rapa Nui people were captured and taken to Peru. That was roughly half the island's population. Half, these captives included the king, Murata, and virtually all of the island's wise men, the individuals who could read and write Rongorongo, the mysterious, undeciphered script unique to Easter Island. They were forced to work in Peru's brutal guano mines on the Quincha Islands, or as plantation laborers. The conditions were horrific. Within 2 years, about 90% of them were dead. 90%. Tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, brutal working conditions. All killed people who had never been exposed to these diseases, whose immune systems had no defenses. International pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors. In 1863, they sent them back. But of the original 1,400 captured, only about 470 remained alive to make the journey home. By the time the ship reached Easter Island, only 15 had survived the voyage. 15 people out of nearly 1,500, and those 15 survivors brought with them something more deadly than the slave. Ships, smallpox, the epidemic that followed was catastrophic. With no natural immunity to this old-world disease, the virus ripped through the remaining population. Accounts from the time describe people dying so quickly there weren't enough survivors to bury the dead. By 1864, when Catholic missionary Eugene Arrow arrived, he found approximately 2,000 people. By 1872, the population had plummeted to just 111 people. From a population that had been around 3,000 just a decade earlier, think about what was lost in those years. Not just lives, though that's tragedy enough. But the last keepers of Rongorongo died. The oral histories passed down through generations died with their storytellers. The songs, the chants, the precise knowledge of how to carve and move the moai, the full context of what the statues meant, it all vanished in less than a generation. What happened to Easter Island wasn't ecocide, it was genocide. Not self-inflicted environmental collapse, but devastation brought by foreign invaders. But we're not done, because even this wasn't the end of the suffering. In 1888, Chile annexed Easter Island. The government then leased most of the island to the Easter Island Exploitation Company for sheep ranching. The remaining Rapa Nui people were confined to the village of Hangaro. They became essentially prisoners on their own island, forbidden from leaving the village boundaries without permission. This lasted until 1953. Until then, the Rapa Nui people were confined to a small area of their own homeland, watching as sheep grazed over their ancestral lands, over the agricultural terraces their ancestors had built, over the sacred sites where their people had worshipped for centuries. If any remaining palm saplings had survived the rats in human clearing, the sheep finished them off. The Pashalakoko's palm went extinct. Now, you might be wondering, what about the moai? What about the toppled statues? The abandoned quarry at Rano-Raraku, with nearly 400 unfinished moai in various stages of completion. Doesn't that suggest some kind of societal collapse? Here's the thing, the dates don't match up. Many moai were toppled after European contact, possibly during conflicts that arose after the demographic catastrophe of the 1860s, or simply because maintaining them became impossible with such a drastically reduced population. The unfinished statues in the quarry, they represent an ongoing cultural practice that was interrupted not by environmental collapse, but by external devastation. Throughout the period of deforestation, the Rapa Nui had actually developed something remarkable. When the traditional ancestor worship centered on the moai began to wane, possibly as early as the mid-1600s, a new religious system emerged. The Birdman cult, or Tangata Manu. This wasn't a sign of collapse, it was a sign of cultural evolution, of a society adapting its beliefs to new circumstances. The cult centered on the village of Orongo, perched on the rim of the Ranokau volcano. Each spring, during the arrival of the migratory sooty turnbirds, a competition was held. Representatives from different clans would descend the 300-foot cliffs, swim nearly 2 miles through shark-infested waters to the tiny islet of Motu Nui, and compete to retrieve the first egg of the season. The winner didn't personally become the Birdman. Instead, his clan chief was declared the Tangata Manu for that year, embodying the god Make and holding both spiritual authority and control over resources. It was a way to resolve interclan competition without warfare. A sophisticated political system that maintained social order on a resource-limited island. The Birdman cult persisted until around 1866 or 1867. The last recorded Tangata Manu was a man named Rokunga. The cult ended not because the society collapsed, but because European missionaries suppressed it, and because there were simply too few people left to continue the tradition. So what's the truth about Easter Island? Here it is. The Rapa Nui people arrived around 1200 CE and established a thriving culture. They and the rats they brought inadvertently deforested the island over several centuries. But rather than collapsing, the Rapa Nui adapted. They developed sustainable agricultural practices, continued their monumental architecture, and evolved their religious and political systems. By the time Europeans arrived, they had achieved a stable population, living within their environmental constraints. The population crash, the true collapse, came not from within, but from without. Slave raids removed half the population. Disease killed most of the rest. Colonial exploitation confined survivors to a fraction of their homeland. The story we've been told, that Easter Island is a parable about environmental suicide, about short-sighted people destroying themselves. It's not just wrong, it's an injustice to the Rapa Nui people. It erases the reality of what happened to them. It turns victims of genocide into authors of their own demise. Today, Easter Island has a population of around 8,000 people, nearly half of whom identify as Rapa Nui. Tourism is the main economy. The Moai still stand, silent witnesses to both the achievements and the suffering of the people who created them. The island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its archaeological importance. But perhaps more importantly, it should be recognized for what it really represents. Not a cautionary tale about environmental limits, though those are real and important, but a story of human resilience and adaptation. A story of a people who made the best of an isolated home, who created art and culture and systems of living sustainably. And ultimately, a story of how contact with the wider world can devastate isolated populations. The real lesson of Easter Island isn't about Moai or trees. It's about the fragility of human societies in the face of disease, slavery, and colonialism. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy their world. The world came to them and nearly destroyed them instead. But they survived, and their descendants remain on the island today, keeping alive what memories they can of a culture that endured for centuries before being nearly wiped out in just a few devastating years. That's the real story of Easter Island. Not a simple parable, but a complex history of adaptation, resilience, tragedy, and survival. The Moai still stand, facing inland, as they have for centuries. Not monuments to a failed civilization, but testaments to one that endured far longer and adapted far better than the myth would have us believe.